7 tanks that carved the path to victory in the deadliest war in human history.
57,000 units built before the guns fell silent, a number no German tank program ever came close to matching. The T-34-85 emerged from hard combat lessons learned on the Eastern Front, where earlier variants had struggled against the long-barreled guns of the Panzer IV and the Tiger. Soviet engineers grafted the 85mm ZIS S-53 gun onto an enlarged 3-man turret, solving the crippling 1-man turret problem that had cost so many commanders their lives. The gun could punch through a Panzer IV at 800 meters with ease. Reliability and simplicity drove every design choice. Components were interchangeable, repairs were fast, and training time was short enough to cycle fresh crews into battle within weeks. At Bagratan in the summer of 1944, T-34-85 brigades tore through Army Group Center with a ferocity that shattered an entire German front in days. Production lines never stopped. The T-34-85 did not just win battles, it industrialized victory.
German Tiger crews reported shell impacts that did not just penetrate, they destroyed. The IS-2 Model 1944 carried a 122mm D-25T gun, originally developed for artillery, adapted for tank use with devastating results. Its penetrating shell could defeat the frontal armor of a Tiger I at close range, and the high explosive round it fired could demolish a reinforced building in a single shot. The 1944 model introduced a single-piece nose casting that eliminated the vulnerable lower plate joint of earlier versions, making the hull significantly harder to kill. Only about 3,500 were built, which made commanders deploy them carefully, assigning IS-2 regiments to the heaviest breakthrough tasks. Crew survivability was a known weakness. The IS-2 used separate propellant charges, limiting the rate of fire to 2 or 3 rounds per minute.
In the assault on the Silo Heights in April 1945, IS-2 regiments led the charge against prepared German defenses, absorbing plenishment and returning it tenfold. It was not the most numerous Soviet tank of the war, but it was the most feared.
Soviet soldiers called it Zveroboy, the Beast Slayer. The ISU-152 mounted a 152mm ML-20S howitzer on the hull of the IS tank chassis, creating a self-propelled gun heavy enough to demolish any German armor or fortification it could reach. Development accelerated in early 1943 after the appearance of German Tiger and Panther tanks demonstrated that existing Soviet guns were struggling. A single 152mm high-explosive round landing near a Tiger was frequently enough to damage its running gear, optics, and crew, even without a direct penetrating hit. The concussive effect alone could incapacitate a crew. Over 4,000 were produced before the war ended. The ISU-152 operated in independent heavy self-propelled artillery regiments, used as assault guns to lead infantry into fortified positions that lighter vehicles could not crack. At Berlin itself, ISU-152 units fired directly into German strongpoints at near point-blank range, collapsing buildings onto defenders. The reload was slow and crew positions cramped, but no German position felt safe when one was in the street. It was not a tank, it was a siege weapon on tracks, and Berlin fell partly because of it. It was obsolete before the war entered its final phase, and irreplaceable in the years that preceded it. The T-34-76 Model 1943 represented the peak of the original T-34 lineage before the 85mm turret replaced it, incorporating a commander's cupola that finally allowed Soviet tank commanders to observe the battlefield without opening the hatch. The V2 diesel engine reduced fire risk compared to gasoline-powered German tanks, a meaningful advantage in combat where burning vehicles were a daily reality. By 1943,
German anti-tank guns had caught up with the original armor specification, forcing Soviet commanders to compensate with mass and speed rather than protection. Kursk, in July 1943, became the proving ground. T-34/76 units absorbed staggering losses, but continued pressing into German lines, denying the Wehrmacht the operational pause it needed.
The Model 1943 introduced sloped hull armor refinements and improved transmission reliability over earlier variants, making it marginally more survivable and significantly easier to maintain in the field. Tens of thousands were built across multiple factories simultaneously. It carried the Soviet Union through its darkest period and across the turning point of the entire war. Its silhouette stopped Western observers cold at the Berlin Victory Parade in September 1945. The IS-3 introduced a radically redesigned hull with a pike-nose bow, angling the frontal armor so steeply that most wartime anti-tank guns could not achieve penetration at any practical combat range. The distinctive hemispherical turret minimized the shot trap present in earlier Soviet designs while keeping internal volume acceptable for a three-man crew. Development had begun in 1944 after combat analysis of IS-2 losses identified the hull front as the primary vulnerability. Production reached approximately 1,200 units by the end of the war, with the first vehicles arriving too late to participate in the Berlin fighting in any significant numbers. Its 122mm gun matched the IS-2 in firepower. The IS-3 did not define the Eastern Front, it defined what came after. When NATO planners looked east in the late 1940s, the IS-3 was the machine that shaped their threat assessments and accelerated their own tank development programs. It arrived at the end of one war and reordered the thinking that governed the next. Thousands of Soviet tankers survived their worst engagements in 1944 because this machine had reached the front before the Germans could stabilize their lines. The Su-100 mounted the 100mm D-10S gun on the proven T-34 chassis, producing a tank destroyer capable of penetrating the frontal armor of a Panther at 1,000 meters, a range at which earlier Soviet guns had been nearly ineffective against that target. It replaced the Su-85 in production from late 1944 onward, with over 2,000 delivered before the German surrender. The low silhouette of the casement hull made it difficult to spot and hard to hit at distance. Soviet doctrine used tank destroyer regiments in ambush positions and flanking roles, allowing the Su-100 to engage before being engaged. At Lake Balaton in Hungary in March 1945, Su-100 units helped repel the last major German armored offensive of the war, destroying vehicles the Soviets could not have handled with confidence a year earlier. The gun that made it lethal would later define a generation of Soviet post-war tank armament. The Su-100 arrived exactly when the war needed it most.
Underestimated. That single word defines how the T-70 entered the war and how most histories have treated it since. Built to replace the obsolete T-60 light tank, the T-70 used two truck engines linked to a common gearbox, a compromise driven by industrial necessity rather than engineering preference. Its 45mm gun was modest against medium tanks, but effective against armored cars, half-tracks, artillery, and the lighter armored vehicles the Germans deployed in enormous numbers on secondary fronts. Nearly 8,000 were produced between 1942 and 1944, making it the second most numerous Soviet tank of the entire war. Crews operated under severe constraints. The two-man crew left the commander doubling as loader, degrading situational awareness and rate of fire simultaneously. Yet, T-70 units covered flanks, screened infantry, and held ground in sectors where heavier tanks could not be spared.
It was on a T-70 that the future Soviet marshal and celebrated ace Dmitry Lavrenenko
earned several of his engagements before transitioning to heavier armor. The T-70 never won the decisive armored duel, but it kept the Army moving when nothing else was available.
7 machines, one industrial revolution in steel and doctrine. The Soviet Union entered 1941 with the largest tank fleet on Earth and nearly lost everything. It rebuilt, redesigned, and relearned, and by 1945 it had forged an armored force that had no equal on the planet. These vehicles were not perfect. They were produced in conditions of extraordinary hardship by workers who understood exactly what the cost of failure meant. That knowledge shaped every weld. The road to Berlin was paved with them.